Modern Melbourne is a series that documents the extraordinary practice of our most important architects and designers and looks at their lasting impact on Melbourne. Today we speak with Greg Burgess. Greg Burgess, born in 1945, is a unique figure in Australian architecture, recognised for his collaborative approach and strong connections with Indigenous communities, creative artists and community groups. Over 5 decades, he has used architecture to foster relationships with clients and country, creating spaces full of meaning and spirit. Burgess has received numerous accolades, including the 2004 Gold Medal from the Australian Institute of Architects, the AIA Sir Zelman Cowen Award, and the 2023 National Award for Enduring Architecture. In 2011, he was appointed a member of the Order of Australia for his contributions to architecture, environmentally sensitive building design and community work. The Eltham Library, built over 30 years ago, exemplifies his dedication to community-focused design. Unlike many of his peers, Burgess has consistently championed this approach, producing work noted for its complex geometries, innovative materials, and deep cultural insights. Great to be here with you today, Greg, and I've got many questions to ask you, and we might even have some jokes as well. You were born in Newcastle in 1945, and it almost seems like a portent in some ways that you were born between the bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then you grew up there before moving to Melbourne in 1957. What was it about your formative years in Newcastle that maybe led you to architecture?
Well, there are very big skies and big ocean, beaches, but I spent a lot of time around jetties and wharves, fishing and exploring the underneath. So those structures were very dramatic and had quite an impact on my young memory. And there was a school opposite where we lived where I used to go crawling in the underfloor space. It must have been some sort of balance to the big skies and agoraphobia of the wide streets and things, but and the slash of sunlight coming through the floorboards under the building was a spatial experience that I've held strongly for ever since.
And, you know, even in this building today, Eltham Library, you get a sense of being enclosed in different spaces with filtered light coming through. And I'm not going to say it's like a wharf or a jetty, but I can see in this building the idea of, we always associate jetties with timber and pylons, which we have a few in here, and, sun striking on those different textures. So in some ways you've sort of carried it through.
There was also another experience which was my parents very enthusiastically getting stuck into a rather brutal modernist makeover of our house, our little Californian bungalow.
As parents want to love to do.
But even at my age, I was under 10
or
8 or something, I was quite shocked. All the detail, the sun canopies and the stained glass and everything came out, and they updated it as they saw fit.
What drew you then to study architecture afterwards? Was it something you always felt that you needed to do, or was it something that happened over time?
I was interested in art and architecture and psychology at school, and my English teacher, who I'm still friends with now after all this time.
Yeah, Ken Rigby.
Yeah. He had a lovely little Alistair Knox house, which was built in the 50s, I suppose.
Yeah.
And very Japanese influence, beautiful little place. So that had an impact when I was at school. And then
when you moved to Melbourne,
Yeah, when I moved to Melbourne. And also Ken Rigby had introduced me to an architect when I was at school who had just come back from Sweden. And I really appreciated and liked his warmth and earthiness and sophistication. And there was something about him that architecture and this person seemed to call a bit. I mean, I thought that I liked that.
And did you see then at that point architecture as a way to integrate other creative disciplines or art or?
Well, certainly I'd thought about architecture as being something like bringing function together with art. That was a sort of an early idea that appealed to me.
Rather than just function as maybe your parents did in their renovation.
That's right. That was a shock, that one.
From there, you went on to university at the Atelier, as I think it was then called, at Melbourne Uni in 1964. And you were, at the beginning, you were in those Nissen huts that they had there. Do you want to say a little bit about your experience there in the huts and the way that you learned at university?
Yeah, those the Nissen huts were fantastic. I mean, they were just not precious like new buildings might be. So the walls were made of kainite, and we knocked holes through the kainite, linked up spaces, adapted to what we were doing at the time. And it was just an excellent studio atmosphere. And the librarian there, Frank Kellaway, was a novelist. And he offered himself for the design studios as a client for a writer's retreat. And that was one of our first assignments, was to design this writer's retreat for Frank. And I was very excited about the possibility of this real client, a real project, and something about bringing that into play with the human element, getting to know him and what his needs were, and then it might be built. That was one of the things. He said, look, if we come up with something good, I might build it. And I was just very excited.
You had some teachers, Jeff Turnbull and Hugh O'Neill. Were they influential?
Oh, they were just very supportive, more like the edge between friendship and teacher. And they ran a kind of Bauhausy kind of course, which was great. I mean, there was some fantastic, Hugh devised some spatial exercises which were quite extraordinary, really, with sugar cubes and gluing them together into some form and then pouring hot water over it so the sugar went and got the void spaces, and he had all sorts of...
It sounds like an exercise we should bring back to contemporary architectural studios. And I think at that time you'd pretty much, some point during university, had rejected the role of the architect as a kind of hero. And I think the whole sort of Ayn Rand architect as master thing in favour of archigram, which surprised me a bit when I learnt that.
Just some of the ideas.
Just because of their options, changing growth and adaptability and that sort of thing.
Buildings as alive, animated.
And
it was a bit sort of literal, but...
Also Christopher Alexander, who was very keen on wanting architects to listen more, I guess.
Yeah. And very hands-on, and the heart was in play, which interested me. You know, the feeling realm. And so the modern movement, while there's some architects I admired there, I was more interested in the organic stream, probably. Which the archigram had aspects of that.
Yeah, they did. I think that, they definitely did.
And the human being coming into play.
Yes.
With the buildings more.
And I think in a way, you had your gap year in 1968, but you'd worked for an architect in London first and then Copenhagen.
Yeah, I went to see James Sterling and had a chat with... I'd met him in Denmark previously. then after a while, I was in Denmark by myself, actually, too. And I wanted that. I left my friends. They went to London. I went to Copenhagen. And I wanted to kick away the props of my life, my middle-class life, and find out a bit more about who I was or what the world was like. And that was quite challenging. And I wanted to experience loneliness because I hadn't been lonely up to then. And that was challenging.
Well, that's what gap years are all about, Greg, taking you out of Melbourne and putting you somewhere else. But I think what interests me is that at that point, housing in Northern Europe and probably in England as well was a really interesting focus, was a focus for architects. And I think, as we know, it's very topical now in Australia. And you were quite interested in the new towns of people like Arnie Jacobson and Ulsan.
Well, James Sterling was, at the time I visited him, was actually working on a new town.
Yeah, that's right.
And, there was Arne Jacobson.
And Erskine. Who was a great participatory architect.
Yeah, really, really inspiring.
Yeah.
And also Ewan Utzon, I went to see his housing. The Opera House was only just finished there. It wasn't finished, perhaps. I don't think it was,
Yeah.
But his courtyard houses I was very interested in and quite influenced by them in taking them into 3 dimensions more, into multi-storey work, which I did when I was in 3rd year at uni.
You completed your degree in 1970 and then worked with Edgar Perotta, who was kind of very adept at doing modernist houses.
Well, he had a practice while he was still at uni.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. And then you went on to work for Darryl Jackson and Evan Walker on one of their great, almost last brutalist buildings, I suppose, the music school in Canberra. Do you want to say a little bit about those 2 experiences?
I really admired Darryl Jackson and Evan Walker as a partnership.
Yeah.
They were terrifically complementary, and they set up their office in an old shoe factory, and it was quite a democratic setup in some ways. Darryl and Evan were in the space and available. Things were pretty transparent, and Darryl would go around and nudge you off your stool to show you, give a little talk on Windows.
Oh, yes.
There was a conversation pit, which was a very 70s thing, I suppose, but where we'd have morning tea and afternoon tea and exchange ideas, and Darryl and Evan would come down in there sometimes. So it was a good experience, and the social aspect that Evan brought to Darryl's design capacity was terrific. I mainly worked on toilets, probably on the music school, but I did have some ideas about other parts of the building which I put forward, but they weren't taken up. So
no.
I was a bit... I wondered why that was.
And maybe in some ways that prompted you to strike out on your own.
Yeah, it's
really.
True. Yeah, after less than 2 years, I knew I wanted to get out, and I was restless. I wanted to be right next to the client, and in that conversation with the client.
All architects want to be in control of their own destiny, I guess, one way or another. And
then
you've
got to let go too sometimes.
Yes. Your practice started in Carlton and you worked in and around Carlton. You did some jobs there, I think the Carlton Community Health Service. And at that time you also did a lot of houses, which when I look at them, they're very, very interesting, some of those early houses. What do you want to say about that time working in Carlton and maybe the milieu, the cultural milieu of Carlton at that time?
I spent the whole 70s in Carlton. My first offices were in the front rooms of terrace houses in Drummond Street, up the north end where Corrigan later went. Then I had an office and a balcony overlooking Jimmy Watson's in Lygon Street in the old Holsworth funeral parlour. And I lived out the back, so my clients came in the Readings bookshop, the original Readings bookshop, which started there. And I was invited by Deborah White, who was a tutor of mine at university, to come in on some childcare centres at Wimble Street Cooperative, the Italo-Australian Education Foundation in Station Street.
Which is still there, that building.
Yeah, well, they were important opportunities to move from houses into public work, more community work. And I really, took that with both hands.
Greg, we're here in Eltham Library, which is 30 years old. A lot of the things that you've talked about, we can see here, the filtered light, the interest in geometries, the natural materials. What can you tell us about this building and its origins, particularly in regards to its genesis and its formation?
The council wanted to revisit their identity, to freshen it up, update, because it sort of came out of the Montsalvat of the 20s. There's a slightly wabi-sabi quality out this way, and the building has some of that too. It's not too overly detailed. The curved ceilings, which are sort of like light scoops, are lined in mountain ash, which was radially sawn and still green. It was put up on the curves because it was nice and flexible, and there was allowance made for the timber to shrink. So when the slats shrink, there's an acoustic blanket behind that sort of picks up the sound. So it gives quite a nice soft sound to the whole library. But that's sort of bringing together of the form, the aesthetics, the materiality, the light, and I suppose an engineering, architectural detail.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing, because we were talking about the elliptical skylight here, which is also evident from above if you're looking down it with a drone or bird's eye. And what's amazing about that, I think, is you did not do the constructional detailing or working out the geometry with computers. It was all done by hand. So you would make the model, measure the dimensions of the model, and then put that on your drawings. And I imagine there must have been quite a bit of work on site working with the builders as you were working out different geometries and different details.
Yeah, well, we actually had a project management, construction management, procurement here for the building. So it was good being able to consult with the engineers, but also the building teams.
But it's an artisanal way of approaching architecture and its development through construction.
Which felt really good.
Rather than a machinic way, isn't it?
Yeah,
really?
It is.
Yeah. And the skylights, the light sort of filters out from the centre of the building. What was the word we used the other day? Ripples.
Ripple. It's quite a big footprint, and the light comes in through these concentric scoops, and they're like veils, curved veils of light that give a sense of layering and connect up the still centre here with a rather mobile perimeter. The sort of movement and kind of restless space pushing out and gathering in.
It's a chocolate ripple cake, isn't it? The light ripples out.
Yeah, it does ripple. It is like water or light, and very layered. So the geometry is not tyrannical. It's not. It's actually more of a dance, I think, rather than a sort of neoclassical.
Yeah. It's not imposed, and it's not hierarchical.
And it sort of suggests other possibilities. It has adaptability, and this building is adapted through the change over to computers. This used to be the circulation desk, the children's area over there. So it's it's actually been able to gracefully move with the change, I think.
Yeah. I think it'd be good if we move on and talk about some of your other seminal projects or important turning points, seed moments. And I think going back from Eltham Library, which was 94, we could go back to the Four Melbourne Architects exhibition of 1979, which obviously at that point you were working in your own right. And Peter Corrigan asked you to join the Four Melbourne Architects. And Peter, I think from what you've previously told me, was a great and generous mentor or encourager of your work. And I think your work obviously quite different from his. And yet he still had the generosity to, not see you as a rival of some kind.
Well, I think he saw us both as kind of mavericks.
Mavericks.
And I remember him talking about me inhabiting the dignity of the margins.
The dignity of the margin.
Which I really liked.
I think I can imagine. I can see that is exactly the sort of thing that he would say. That particular exhibition meant a lot to you because it was both a time of personal crisis and it was a time where you felt the struggle with taking creative risks and that sort of thing. Do you want to say a bit more about that exhibition?
Yeah, well, this was a real turning point in my life and my career, I think. And so when Corrigan asked me, I kind of freaked out, really, because I was quite, at that time, this personal crisis of my brother tragically dying and finishing a relationship. I felt quite vulnerable, and going public seemed like quite a difficult thing. I had no idea what the value of my work was. I was having some things published, but I didn't feel very confident. But I took a deep breath and eventually said yes, because as you said, I felt the need to take risk, to change. Yeah, I was in some ways artistically constipated. So as a means of getting things going to meet this challenge, this exhibition, I started writing. And this writing, I was putting down everything that mattered to me passionately and exploring things. So it was quite a flow, open, impromptu kind of thing. But this sort of worked, and I was freed up and was able to move into this occasion with the exhibition with Peter and Maggie and Peter Crone and Norm Day, with some enthusiasm and confidence.
Writing then became part of your working practice, didn't it, as a way of release and a different way to annotate, denote, or work through particular issues particularly on your sketch drawings.
Yeah. Well, I started a habit around then of having process sheets where I'd collage together from the whole process, sketches, writing, and then also do another layer on top of that again on the collage. And I found this helpful in retrospectively discovering what I'd done, which is an interesting, that retrospective knowledge is quite important to be able to do consciously.
Hackford House. Now, if this is my joke, right? If this is a ripple cake, Hackford House could be seen as a wedding cake in the way that it's sort of tiered up into the tower that overlooks the landscape. Do you want to say a little bit about that? Because I think what's interesting about that house is it's not just plonked in the landscape. It does have this theme of homecoming in it, which I think was important for the client, and the way that the house was positioned on the site.
I suppose, the Hackford House came out of that period around the exhibition time too. It was right the first house that was of this new frame of mind. One of the important things too was I was offered a job as a healer with my therapist, and I didn't take that on, but I started to develop an idea of architecture as a healing art. And Garth, the client for this house, was beautifully describing his journey home from his practice in town in Traralgon, home to his site where we're going to do the house, and the beautiful valley coming down across the creek, turning back, losing sight of the house, finding the house, and the nature of journey and the nature of longing for home. And this is both in the literal sense of the house, but also in our spiritual journey from where we come from and where we go after we die. So that journey and longing, or Sehnsucht, a longing, unspecified longing, connected up with Hackford it was something I was interested in at the time, and brought that to the brief. And it seemed like a very good fit to mirror back to Garth, these thoughts. And he engaged very strongly in that idea. We wanted to build across the creek, but we couldn't. So that's where we did the waterfall under the house and the fountain in the courtyard you crossed. You could see through the floor, the glass floor, down to the waterfall. And there were 3 stairs going up to the tower, sort of a substantial one, a spiral, and then a ladder. So there was sort of an engagement of the body quite strongly with the house. And there's a veranda room which works as an acoustic space too, for the birds and the sound of the river, the creek.
It was done or completed around 1980, so not long after for Melbourne architects. So you must have been pretty happy that you've got through this kind of crisis and you'd taken more creative risks and then did this.
And there was sort of axis with the house too, and thresholds of transition, and a sort of balance, difficult dynamic balance between chaos and order, and appreciating the complexity of the house was an important part of the conception of it.
Now, the next project that you did that you saw as being important for you was the 1987 Horsham Catholic Church, which was really where you were really engaged with that particular community and the Catholic priest there who said to you, it was a competition, I believe, and then you rang him up and he said that he wanted the new building to be a symbol of what we ought to quote, what we ought to become, and help us become what we ought. So do you want to talk a little bit about
it's slightly old-fashioned language, but I found that so exciting, the acknowledgement of architecture as a vehicle of transformation, and the building as active participant in the evolution of spiritual consciousness. So I was really on for that one. And rather naughtily probably was on the phone to the priest quite a bit to get more information and to work through a concept. There was quite a lot of engagement of the parishioners. There were parishioners involved as the bricklayers, the carpenters, the builders, Plaza Brothers. The opening was like a medieval kind of ritual.
Yeah.
With the gifts being brought straight out of a Renaissance painting, really.
And I believe at the opening there was also an ice cream cake of the church, which gets us back to
your ice cream cakes.
The theme. In your archive where you have many models, I've also noticed that there were models of the furniture inside the church and different options for lecterns, or I assume altar as well, but also pews. So I think from my reading of it, the Horsham Church, it almost seems like a a total work of art
Yeah.
in some ways,
Yeah, I think so.
with all these different inputs into it. It's not just you, but it's you working with the priest, working with the local community. And at the same time, even though it wasn't finished until 1990, you were also working with another completely different community at Brambrook, the Brambrook Living Cultural Centre in Garryword. And you actually went there to stay with that community or communities. There were 5 different Indigenous groups that you were working with. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your experiences there with that project?
Yeah, well, Brambrook, the building is in the national park, which was controversial. The beginning point was camping out on the site with representatives of the 5 groups. And it was a big feast, lots of drinking, storytelling, dancing, chanting. We had a boomerang throwing session before. But as the night wore on, I went into my tent and I heard some of the stories about the stolen generation, the history and effects of genocide. These stories were very moving and grown men crying, and it had a deep effect on me. And that's one of the reasons the building has embodied in it suffering and hope through the form, the undulation of the roof and the buckling and the lifting. So that was how that found its way as expression into the building from that night. And there was 18 months of workshop with members of the group working through a lot of different options. And there was some of the members of the community worked on the building, the carpenters.
And then the building was then self-built, really.
Not totally, because there was a local site foreman who improvised an amazing steam chamber to get the wood into a sort of limp state that could be wrapped around the curves, improvising bricks and copper and concrete pipes and as a steam chamber.
And then those timber structure pieces and those curves then help to form the roof, which has this sort of amazing wave or shape to it, set against the hills or mountains of Garryword. I mean, it's actually incredible.
And that was one of the members said, let's get it talking to the mountains. And that's where that came from. It was a very strong poetic sense of how the building should connect and respond.
And, for many architects now who are more interested or more cognizant of country and the need to connect to country, I mean, I think that particular project is really important. It seems to me it is a poetry that acknowledges sorry business, acknowledges history of colonisation and, frontier wars, but also this poetry also is hopeful. It's almost like a gift to the landscape in some ways, what happened there.
A gift to the landscape. It was thought of as a refuge for the ancestors. So the thought that they were to be gathering in this shelter, in this refuge, the building as refuge, because it's a nuanced building in that sense, and there's quite subtle reminders of the mourning that's going on. The way we used big trunks there too, and some of the trunks have windows behind them where you don't see the window, but the light spills around the trunk in a very moving way. So it was, I suppose, finding subtle but powerful ways of the building speaking to the condition and the history, the difficult history of these communities.
Your next important or seminal building was the Uluru Kata Cultural Centre at Uluru for the Mutijulu community, and you lived there for a month with other people. That was completed in 1995. But also, ancestral beings were an important aspect of that particular project. But do you want to say a little bit about staying there for that month and working with that community?
It was an expression, that building, of the joint management of the national park by Anangu, the people of this area, and the National Parks and Wildlife. So there was traditional ways combined with Western science in the management of the park. And this building that we were doing was to celebrate that. So there was roughly the process was sitting around an aerial photograph and getting the stories down on the happened around the rock. We commissioned some paintings, a women's painting and a law painting, Chokapa painting. So over that month, what was important was a kind of unfolding of events and exchanges. We had a studio set up in the Mutijulu community, and there was an establishment of warmth and trust with the community. And one of the women who'd done a commissioned women's painting, she was walking the site and getting a very strong feeling of she wanted the building to express the Anangu and the National Parks rangers working together as one. So it's two and the one, and this form of the interlocking spirals she made with her hands, and I immediately sketched that onto the sand, knowing that it was a really important thing to observe. And that form then became, in a natural, organic way, a leitmotif for the whole building. The women would sit under this particular desert oak for their meetings while we were there. And I had the strong sense that would be the entry point. And I did some dowsing on the site as a conversation with the site to get a sense of where the spaces would go. It sort of came through, and they were doing paintings and drawings, some of the artists in the community, that fed into this process. So an incredibly important part of this was having time. I'd suggested
in that month
we needed time to understand each other, to know what this whole thing needed to be. So the time and the synchronicity of what happened day to day, what we noticed was the encounters we had with Anangu. By the end of the month, we had an agreed concept, which Anangu felt was theirs. And
so you were really a channel, weren't you?
I think so.
And your team.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting contrast to Brambook, because the cultures between different Indigenous groups, different language groups, are really quite different. They're not all the same. But I think the commonality seems to be that with Brambook and with Uluru is that you were a channel. And through that participatory process, you weren't imposing, but you were listening. And the other thing that I remember in previous conversations we've had, as part of that monthly process, you were gathering in the stories from Anangu, from everyone in the region, and then recording them, and then the women were painting those stories, and that all contributed to the process.
Yeah, and those stories were the gift
That almost brings us to ways of working. And I think in these projects, from the beginning, it's like up until this one and then beyond, it is all these interweaving elements. And it is that idea that the architect can be a healer of communities, regardless of that particular type of community, that the buildings are living, and that in our communities, architects can also tap into, I think, a spiritual dimension as well as a community dimension, as well as a dimension related to use and also landscape, and bring all those things together, which is very different to the way that your parents renovated their house. Sorry.
Yeah. But I suppose, generation to generation we learn something. And but I think, one of the big issues here, and like with the Indigenous European colonist Indigenous issues in Australia, there's a big split going on with nature. It's been, lessened in Indigenous communities. The European colonists, the split's widening, split between ourselves and the world. And architecture can be one of the ways that we can consciously start to heal that, I think. It really is a potential vehicle for helping us become more conscious and more connected with each other and nature and culture, and the respect and the gratitude that we should have for such an ancient and detailed, sophisticated culture, or the cultures really. As you said, many different expressions of that. To be present in the listening and the sensing as to what's really going on. What can we work with? What are we given permission to work with? How do we work together? How do we have time to work together? It's a different sense of time and expectation to be present. And the middle space, the space between, is a critical dynamic space in which reconciliation can happen, which the balance of polarities can happen.
But you can see that middle ground here because of the gradation of the light, the gradation of the spaces. It isn't a black and white thing. It isn't the architects just plonked a building, a house or whatever it is into the countryside, cut out some big windows for some big views, which is like, I don't know what that is. But this is more like ourselves. And that middle space is more like ourselves with all those different gradations. And that, I think, is something that you realised in another project that we might finish up with, which is the Architecture as Idea exhibition, where in that you thought about those ideas of moving on or progressing ourselves or working on our own consciousness. And that's kind of what buildings are about. Do you want to explain that a bit more or expand on it?
I think there's something to be said for identifying ourselves very strongly with our buildings, like our buildings as ourselves, in a way, with the human gesture and responsiveness with context and with people and spirit. That exhibition you mentioned, Architecture as Idea, the piece for that was a tall, twisted, galvanised steel sort of tower shaft and an entry made from red gum saplings and quilted bark. so that you had to duck under that sort of timber structure to stand up in the steel structure, which was painted deep sky blue. At the top there was a skylight with a suspended glass orb that when you got inside, stood up, you could reach up and pull that orb, and the skylight opened like a flower, flooding the space with light. So I wrote a little caption for it in the exhibition at RMIT Gallery. The art of architecture, like the art of life, is a way of transformation. It urges us to reach deep within and high above ourselves so that we can bear and share the future, bear and share the fruits of our journey.
Greg, thank you so much. It's been a great discussion, and I hope this gives many people insights into your work and insights into this fantastic building here at Eltham Library.
Thank you, Peter.
So thank you.
Thank you.